This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon, click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. My guest today is a writer and author. He's the US editor of the London Review of Books and a regular contributor to numerous other publications, as well as a visiting professor at Bard College. His third book, The Rebels Clinic, The Revolutionary Lives of Frantz Fanon, has just been published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Adam Schatz, hello, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you so much for having me, Gilad.
So Frantz Fanon, the protagonist of your book, has become one of the most prominent symbols of the post-colonial struggle. Much of that has to do with the particular trajectory of his life. So maybe we'll start with that. How did a Caribbean-born, French-trained psychiatrist become the chief spokesperson of the Algerian struggle for independence?
It's a great question, Gilad, and it was by no means inevitable. Frantz Fanon was a war hero. He won a Croix de Guerre in the Second World War. Studied psychiatry in Lyon, and originally he had thoughts of working in Senegal. But the job that he got at the end of his studies happened to be in Algeria at the psychiatric hospital in Blida, Joinville, just outside of Algiers. This was about 11 months before the outbreak of the independence struggle. Fanon did not have the faintest idea when he left France to go to Algeria that a revolt would break out, much less that he would take part in it. It was really happenstance, but it also has to do with his ethical and political orientation and his sense, once the revolt did break out, that he belonged on the side of those who were resisting the French colonial project. After all, he himself had been a colonized subject as a Martinican.
Was he always interested in politics, in political theory, even as a younger man?
Well, as a younger man, actually, he was much more drawn to things like football, not unlike someone who was very much on the opposite side of the Algerian War, Albert Camus, who grew up in Algeria, as you might recall. He was drawn into politics in high school, and that was a result of the coming of the Vichy era in Martinique, when he observed all manner of racist aggression committed by French troops there. It was a total shock to him because he had a very romantic understanding of the French, owing to his education. I mean, after all, the first three words that Fanon learned to write were "Je suis français," I am French. His parents were fervent believers in French republicanism. They were Republican socialists. And so Fanon had this self-understanding as that he was a Frenchman of color whose destiny lay with France. And Martinique was tightly bound to the metropole. So it was when he first began to glimpse these contradictions, these hypocrisies, that his curiosity about politics was awakened. And when he was 17 years old, he tried to join the Free French Forces. He wasn't able to, but he decided to try once again. And what's remarkable, too, is that his second effort occurred after Martinique had cast off their Vichy oppressors and restored the authority of the French Republic. Even so, Fanon wanted to go off and fight in Europe. And so he joined the Free French Forces, ended up training in Morocco, passed briefly through Algeria on the way to France. And so by then, yes, he had a political conscience, but it was still very much shaped by a kind of classical French republicanism. It was when he went to France And he found that, for example, some of the people he met did not seem particularly interested in being liberated. And also, when he experienced racism in France, that's when Fanon, I think, began to question really the limits of French republicanism and was drawn into a more radical anti-colonial politics.
But was it really his stay in Algeria that radicalized him, that tipped him
Well, it did.
over the edge?
It
over the
did.
edge?
Well, it did, but he was already having certain intuitions before he arrived in Algeria. For example, Fanon, when he was in Lyon, was taking emergency calls in heavily Algerian populated neighborhood of Lyon near the Rue Mancy, where North African laborers were sleeping 6 or 7 to a room, and they were sending back remittances to their families. And many of these men complained of diffuse physical symptoms that they could not properly locate. A doctor would arrive, and the men would just say, "We feel ill. I feel sick all over." But these men couldn't identify what was ailing them. And French psychiatrists had constructed a whole concept around this phenomenon of the North African syndrome. There have been other iterations of this since then. For example, in the States, there's something called the Puerto Rican syndrome. So, by this account of the North African syndrome, these men were either crazy, malade imaginaire, à la Molière, or they were lazy. They were malingers. They didn't want to show up at work. And Fanon thought differently. He thought that actually this diagnosis, the North African syndrome, reflected a failure on the part of French psychiatry, and also revealed the extent to which French psychiatry itself was permeated by and was perpetuating colonial racism. He viewed these men as victims of a colonial situation, victims of segregation, discrimination, and racism. And he believed that their illness, in a way, was a kind of silent protest. It was their way of saying, we exist. And so even before he went to Algeria, Fanon was gravitating toward a certain kind of anti-colonialism. And we see the evidence of that in his first book, Black Skin, White Masks, which was published in 1952. And there are gestures in that book towards the Vietnamese struggle. There is, more importantly, the critique of negritude, the philosophy of Black consciousness, which Fanon finds wanting because it emphasizes the reclamation of a glorious past in the Songorian version, rather than an existential struggle against racism and colonialism in the present. But it's true, Gilad, you're right, that it really is when he goes to Algeria and sees the full contours of French colonialism there and begins to work with people who have had their lives shattered by French repression, that he is politically radicalized and decides that he needs to join the rebels.
So the fact that he is a psychiatrist really plays a major role in the development of his thought. Can you maybe elaborate a bit more about the connection between mental health and politics for him?
Absolutely. I mean, it's, this is the reason I call the book The Rebels Clinic, because it's my view that Fanon's thinking takes shape in these confined spaces, where he is able to observe the dehumanizing effects of colonial oppression. Fanon is first and foremost a psychiatrist, and he continues to practice psychiatry throughout his life, even after he begins working with the FLN in Tunisia, in exile, where he serves as a kind of spokesman. And then, of course, later he goes on to Accra and becomes the traveling ambassador of Algeria's Republican exile. So, Fanon is someone who is very alert to the connections between politics and the experience, and people's unconscious experiences. He also emphasizes the psychological impact of oppression, the way it impinges upon a person's sense of reality, their sense of existing. I mean, Fanon underscores that the problem of racism is not so much a problem of inferiorization, although that's, of course, a part of it as well. It's about the fear of not existing. And so Fanon's radical existential politics are very much rooted in his practice of psychiatry, and also, as I emphasize in the book, in the kind of psychiatry that he learned when he was in France. Because, Fanon could have been a quite traditional psychiatrist if he had merely followed the training that he received in Lyon under the rather conservative Dr. Deschamps. But Fanon was attracted to other models of psychiatry that he first discovered in journals like Esprit, where radical psychiatric thinkers were drawing upon the insights of Marxism and also surrealism. Then he apprenticed in this new radical form of psychiatry that was known as institutional therapy or social therapy when he did his residency at the Saint-Alban Clinic and found a mentor in this Catalan psychiatrist, François Tosquelles, who's the subject, by the way, of an exhibition at the American Museum of Folk Art, which is opening, I think, today or tomorrow. And Tosquelles is an extraordinary figure. He's a very kind of libertarian Marxist, also arguably kind of anarchist, who came from a Catalan family and during the Spanish Civil War organized the psychiatric services of the PUM, which was the Trotskyist anarchist militia, that ended up being crushed by the communists. And Tosquelles in 1939 was told that he could either leave or he would be eliminated by the Franco regime, and so the Franquistas. And so Tosquelles ended up in a refugee camp in the southwest of France called Setfon. And in Setfon, what did Tosquelles do? He immediately began practicing psychiatry and psychoanalysis. This is the guy who read Lacan when I think he was 16 years old. He had a handlebar mustache. He looked kind of like a clown, and he was a visionary and very playful figure. Fanon, well, before I get to Fanon, Tosquelles ends up at Saint-Alban because a psychiatrist at the Saint-Alban clinic, Paul Balvet, heard of this Catalan refugee psychiatrist who was practicing in a refugee camp, and he went there to meet him and hired him, and Tosquelles, Paul Balvet, and Lucien Bonafé, another radical psychiatrist, joined forces, and during the Second World War, they made sure that every patient was protected. This stood in marked contrast to the experience in other psychiatric wards and asylums during the Second World War, during which between 40 and 50,000 patients died in what was called the soft extermination, l'extermination douce. And Saint-Alban was very different. At Saint-Alban, the psychiatrists stood by their patients, defended them heroically, found ways to make sure that they got their proper rations. And meanwhile, they also provided sanctuary for people like the poet Paul Éluard, who had written a poem, Liberté, that could have gotten him a death sentence. They gave sanctuary to Georges Canguilhem, the historian of science, and various other dissidents and resistance figures. And so Fanon began to hear about the legend of Saint-Alban when he was in Lyon. He was very attracted to it. He met Paul Balvet at a dinner there because Paul Balvet had an apartment in Lyon. And then he went to work there. And he and Tosquelles formed a team. And it was at Saint-Alban that Fanon learned about the methods of radical psychiatry, which he then would apply, but also transform in Algeria.
Yeah, you mentioned several of these men and even Esprit, the journal. I wonder then, what was his take on communism or Marxism in general? Because at the time, in the late imperial age, I mean, communism was really synonymous with revolutionary, with anti-imperialism. And it's also about Fanon's life again, that he was an atheist himself. He was basically from nowhere, right? He was like this roving man. He was like a classic Marxist in the making. What was his take?
He wasn't a Marxist, though. And I mean, while you're right that Marxism contributed significantly to anti-imperialist struggles and, attracted figures like Ho Chi Minh and various revolutionaries in Southern Africa and elsewhere, the record of the French Communist Party when it came to colonialism was an ambivalent and a complicated one, particularly on the subject of Algeria. Remember that Algeria was it was a colony, of course, but the French didn't recognize it as a colony. It had been incorporated into France, annexed, divided into 3 departments in 1848, about 18 years after the colonization, the conquest. And so the official, the fiction around Algeria was that it was France. And the French Communist Party, to some extent, was influenced by this vision. Maurice Thorez, the head of the Communist Party in the late 1930s, had written of Algeria as a land of, I think he said, 20 races. And the impression he gave was that an Algerian people was forming in Algeria, a people comprised of all of these different races. And this was a vision, of course, that overlooked the fact that there was, in fact, a Muslim indigenous majority whose rights had been systematically violated, and that there really wasn't an Algerian people, as it were. It was a very segregated, it was a deeply segregated society. The Jews, of course, in Algeria had been indigenous and were once regarded as indigenous, like the Muslim population. But in 1870, they had been made part of France by the Crémieux Decree, and were treated as French citizens. So when the and the French Communist Party had also looked askance at expressions of Algerian nationalism. The Algerian nationalism embodied by Messali Hajj's party, which went under various names, the PPA, the MTLD. It was always the same party. It was a kind of Islamic nationalist populist party, which had actually emerged out of a group within the Communist Party in France, the Étoile Nord-Africaine, the North African Star. But Hajj had broken free of that because of the primacy of the national question, and the communists looked at him very skeptically. And for example, when Algerians revolted in 1945 in Selma and in Sétif and Guelma, and the French responded by killing about 15,000 Algerians in a matter of weeks, the Communist Party's response was to attack the revolt and to imply that this rebellion, which had been quite bloody, not nearly as bloody as the repression that followed, but it was a bloody riot. The French Communist Party responded by characterizing the demonstrators as Hitlerian, and later on, in the mid-1950s, the French Communist Party supported special powers against the Algerian revolt, against the FLN's revolt. Now, the Algerian communists were a different matter. Algerian communists had worked very closely with Algerian nationalists, had been supporters of independence, but they still had the French Communist Party to deal with, and they had to respect its orders. And so the Algerian Communist Party found itself in a very, very difficult bind. You could argue, in fact, that the French Communist Party never got over the special powers vote. When the FLN formed and the Algerian communists wanted to militate in favor of independence, they received a message from the FLN that you certainly could, you can join us, but you can join us within the FLN. You have to dissolve your own party, which they did, and they worked with the FLN. So Fanon, because of the record of the Communist Party, the French Communist Party in particular, on Algeria, was always very skeptical about the communists. And what's more, because Algeria's revolt was in part based in the countryside, there was obviously a lot of support for it in the cities, But because the revolt had broken out in the so-called bled, in the outback, and because it involved so many people from rural backgrounds, although he tended to romanticize this, he understood that precise Marxist model, wouldn't really work in Algeria. The working class was not the agent of revolution, was not the subject of history, and certainly not the French working class, which had been kind of, you could argue, bought off by the wages of empire. And so he was also skeptical of the Marxist narrative. Having said that, there's no question that Fanon was influenced by Marxism. He was influenced by a certain Marxisant way of thinking. It's just that he really wanted to remain independent of official Marxist thinking, of Western Marxist models, and certainly of the Comintern. And so, yes, there have been plenty of efforts to characterize Fanon as a Marxist, but they're not terribly convincing because he had a very ambivalent relationship to Marxism.
When coming to theorize oppression and, different races and all that, of course, during this time, one major event was the Holocaust and the fate of the Jews. How did he perceive that? The place of the Jews or the predicament of the Jews in the matrix of power relations?
Fanon was certainly aware of anti-Jewish persecution. In Martinique, he had a philosophy professor who told him that if you hear someone talking about the Jews, it probably means they're talking about you. And in Black Skin, White Masks, he drew parallels, also distinctions, but certainly parallels between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. And he writes at one point that the negrophobe is almost invariably an anti-Semite as well. Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks is partly a dialogue with Sartre, obviously with Sartre's essay on the question of race and Black poetry, or Black Orpheus, the preface to the great Songor edited anthology of West Indian and African poetry. But it's also a dialogue with anti-Semite and Jew, Sartre's book Réflexions sur la question juive. And Fanon is interested in what makes anti-Black racism both similar to and different from anti-Semitism. Of course, it's a complicated matter because there are also lines which one doesn't know entirely what to do with. Notably, Fanon's remark that the whole question of the Jews is a kind of European family quarrel. It's an aside, and some writers have taken him to task for it. I think it's. I'm not sure that that line is being read properly because I don't think Fanon is dismissive of the destruction of European Jewry. On the other hand, I do think that Fanon is among those thinkers, and I would also include in that category writers like W.B. Du Bois, Aimé Césaire, and to some extent Hannah Arendt, who, while they grasp the enormity of the Holocaust as a case of industrialized genocide, were also keen to show the ways in which its genealogy and history also related to cases of colonial massacres. In Arendt's work, of course, it's the German massacre of the Herero people in what is now Namibia. With Césaire, there are other examples like the killings in Madagascar by the French army. So I think that it's hard to say, did Fanon view the Holocaust as an exceptional event, or did he see it as a case of European imperial brutality inflicted on other Europeans rather than a colonized people? He never had the opportunity to really develop his thoughts. On the other hand, there are some very interesting moments in Fanon's writing where he reflects on the history of the Holocaust and on its aftermath, notably in The Wretched of the Earth, where he revisits the question of reparations. In Black Skin, White Masks, he's very dismissive of reparations. He declares that he refuses any retroactive reparations for the various sins and crimes committed against his Black ancestors. He wants to create himself as a new person. He's not interested in making the white man feel guilty and so forth. And when you read these things in Black Skin, White Mask, you think, God, Fanon almost sounds like a contemporary Black conservative. But by the time he writes The Wretched of the Earth, he is rethinking this whole matter. And he's rethinking it partly in relation to German reparations after the Holocaust. And so what he argues there is that the colonized have as much of a right as Jewish survivors of the Holocaust to demand some kind of justice, some kind of reparations from their former persecutors. So Fanon was certainly thinking about the Holocaust and how it related or didn't relate to the kinds of violence he wrote about.
What about Zionism and the creation of the State of Israel?
Well, Fanon never wrote about Israel. There are 2 or 3 references, passing references to Israel in his work. There is never a mention of the Palestinians in his work. Now, why is this? There are a number of reasons, I think. First of all, Fanon dies in 1961. This is 6 years before the 1967 war and the Israel's conquests in that war, and before the Israeli occupation begins. And while it's true that his Algerian compatriots were certainly identified with the Palestinians, the relationship between Algeria and Palestine is a fairly deep one, in fact, and there's considerable new scholarship, very interesting scholarship by people like Najib Sidi Moussa, a French scholar, and Arthur Asaroff, who teaches in the UK, about the impact of the war in Palestine on Algerian political consciousness as early as the 1920s and 30s. So these ties of emotional kinship were quite profound. But there was nothing in the way of logistical or strategic alliance between the Palestinians, who, after all, were not really represented by an organization at that point. The Fatah was formed in 1959, I think, and it wasn't until the mid-'60s that the PLO emerges. There are no ties between the Algerians and the Palestinians of any significant nature. So it's possible that Fanon had some sympathies for the Palestinians. It's very possible through his friends in the Algerian movement, but there's no trace of them. We simply don't know. And with respect to the creation of the State of Israel, again, he says nothing. And it's also, I think, important to remember that this was a period in which the French left, and although Fanon is very much a critic of the French left, without a doubt, I mean, some of his severest criticisms are reserved for the French left, he emerges from the French left. And the French left at that time was quite ignorant about Israel-Palestine, and very few members of the French left expressed any concern about the fate of the Palestinians who'd been dispossessed. I mean, the only examples that I can really think of offhand are the anthropologist and sociologist Jacques Berck, who was an authority on the Arab world, and the great scholar Maxime Rodinson, who was a Jewish scholar of the Middle East, whose parents had perished in Auschwitz, and who, in the mid-'60s, I think 66 or 67, would write one of the first books on Israel as a settler colonial state. For the most part, the French left saw Israel as a kind of plucky socialist country and associated Israel with the kibbutzes, not with the project of ethnic cleansing. So it's in a way it's not surprising. Palestine was just not on the map for a lot of people then.
Many people, including yourself, argue that his ideas have been unfairly co-opted and distorted. Can you think of maybe the one major idea that we misunderstand
Well, I think,
today?
yeah, I mean, I would maybe mention two. I mean, I think, and in a sense they're related. Well, first of all, one way in which Fanon is really misunderstood is Fanon is widely perceived as champion of racial consciousness, even of Black nationalism. Now, there should be no misunderstanding here. Fanon was a believer in Black power. He was a believer in Pan-African emancipation. It's not as though he dismissed the question of race. He was not a colorblind universalist who felt that race should be transcended by an act of will. I mean, that's certainly not his view. But he was a critic of negritude. He was not a believer in the idea that that Black people's mission was to recover a sense of themselves as Black people with a glorious past and so forth, which is an idea that one finds in various schools of Black nationalist thought. Fanon certainly believed in anti-racist struggle for the purposes of individual and collective emancipation, but the idea that the future would be a racial or a Black future would have been anathema to him. I mean, let's remember, this is someone who makes it his life's mission to fight alongside people whose background could hardly be more different from his. I mean, his great cause is the Algerian struggle for independence. He aligns himself with so-called white Africans, with Arabs and Berbers, with Muslims. He's an atheist. Fanon is someone who audaciously refuses to be confined to his own lane. And in fact, one of the great criticisms of Fanon lodged by Afro-pessimists who have adopted him as a kind of saintly figure is that Fanon deviated from the sacred path when he went to Algeria. What he should have done is go back to Martinique and do something for his own people. This, interestingly, is a criticism also raised by the Tunisian Jewish writer Albert Memmi in his essay, The Impossible Life of Frantz Fanon, which was published 10 years after Fanon's death. And Memmi's argument was that Fanon's real problem was not how to be Algerian, it was how to be West Indian, it was how to be a Martinican. And, I argue differently. I mean, I think Memmi has some very interesting ideas about Fanon. And to some extent, I borrow his chronology for thinking about the stages of Fanon's self-definition. But I think that there's much to be said in favor of Fanon's decision to lead a kind of nomadic life of political commitment. I mean, there are all sorts of questions that one can raise about it too. I mean, I don't think it was particularly realistic of Fanon to imagine that he could become an Algerian after living 3 years in Algeria and joining the FLN. I mean, it's a fantasy, but it was also an enabling fantasy. It was that idea that allowed him to contribute as an intellectual, as a psychiatrist, and as a man to this struggle. And it's what allowed him to advertise the struggle internationally as a struggle that had universal import, a struggle for human rights and dignity. So that's one respect in which Fanon is misunderstood. And some of the translations have certainly exacerbated matters. I mean, for example, the critical chapter in Black Skin, White Masks is called L'expérience vécue du noir, the lived experience of the Black man. That chapter was translated for many years in English as The Fact of Blackness. There was even an exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London in the 1990s called The Fact of Blackness. But Fanon didn't believe in the fact of blackness. I mean, Fanon was an early believer in what the historian Barbara Jean Fields has called racecraft. I mean, for him, race was an illusion. It was an illusion with very, very powerful real-world effects. But in his view, if racism were overcome, race too would vanish. So that's one important respect in which Fanon has been misunderstood. Fanon wrote very little on Islam, but there is one essay called Algeria Unveiled, about the hayek, the traditional Algerian women's covering, in his book Undying Colonialism. Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution is the French title. And in that chapter, which is it's quite a remarkable essay, he traces the shifting meanings of the veil. His argument essentially is that under colonialism, traditional practices, traditional customs have been reinforced as a kind of defense of the indigenous person against the encroachments of French power, French cultural imperialism. And so women are, in his reading, Algerian society was clinging to these traditional customs as a kind of protection, as an armor. And he writes that these customs amounted to kind of they were dead customs given new life by French colonialism. I'm not saying this is true, by the way. This is Fanon's very modernist reading, and his argument is that during the Battle of Algiers, at a certain point, the FLN sends out women to lay bombs and to to deliver messages, to give guns to other fighters, and these women take off their veils and they begin to experience a different, in his view, liberated relationship to their bodies as they disguise themselves as Europeans. The argument here is that by removing the veil and by joining the battle, they are emancipating themselves not merely from colonialism, they're emancipating themselves from Algerian patriarchy. This did not turn out to be the case, although this was the experience of some women who fought during the war. They felt that they were doing that. Unfortunately, that did not turn out to be the case. But then he charts this other development towards the end of the war when women began to put the veil on again. Now, why did they put the veil on again? They reassumed the veil, in Fanon's account, because the French were trying to forcibly unveil them. France was staging these ceremonies of unveiling. France wanted to proclaim itself a liberator of Algerian women in order eventually to persuade men to support the colonial project against the FLN. The argument was that we are the emancipators, not the FLN. And Fanon's argument here is that now the veil assumes a different significance. It's no longer this article, this kind of dead article that is conservative and complacent and so on. No, now it is an instrument of resistance. Now it has a new meaning. And some scholars have read this article, which is quite interesting, as a defense of Islamic head coverings. It's nothing of the sort. I mean, it's a very subtle reading of the shifting significations of a piece of cloth, depending on a moment in the political struggle and the relationship between Algerians and their occupiers. And in fact, in a correspondence with the Iranian thinker Ali Shariati, who would go on to become a leader of the Iranian Revolution. He died before it ended, but he was a very important figure. Fanon made plain that he felt that it was a mistake to focus on Islam in the revolutionary struggle because it would divert the revolution from a more universal path. Fanon was a modernist. But of course, after the revolution in Iran, people influenced by Shariati would celebrate Fanon as a kind of Islamist thinker. He was nothing of the sort. And we see similar misunderstandings in Fanon's reading of violence, which is much more complicated than a mere celebration of armed violence or terror or whatever you choose to call it.
Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Well, I think that to some extent, the understanding of Fanon's view of violence has been obscured and distorted by the preface that Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, in which Sartre argues that for the colonized to kill a colonizer is to kill two birds with one stone, the oppressor and the man he oppresses. And Sartre goes on to say that the colonized person who has succeeded in killing a European emerges as a new and better person, a new and better man in the language of the time. Sartre, oddly enough, is not it's true that Sartre's preface has been mocked, but we don't tend to think of Sartre as a violent man, whereas Fanon, who never wrote such a line, is remembered as this blood-curdling figure. And frankly, I think this has a lot to do with the fact that Fanon was a black man who was making an argument about the psychologically regenerative properties of violence. I mean, we can actually find similar arguments in a lot of nationalist traditions too, where there's a great emphasis on violence and masculinity. I don't think that Fanon is quite as different, quite as exotic as he's made out to be. And again, I do think race has a lot to do with this misreading. Now, Fanon is not a Gandhian. He is not a pacifist, and he is arguing in favor of armed struggle. He's arguing in favor of armed struggle, of course, partly because the political path in Algeria had been repeatedly blocked by the Pieds Noirs, by the French community, the European community in Algeria. In fact, the Pieds Noirs had succeeded in scuttling not just every initiative by Algeria's various political parties, liberals, nationalists, and so on, but every initiative at reform put forward by the French government in the metropole. So, for example, when the French government wanted to provide citizenship for about 20,000 members of the Algerian elite, the Algerian Muslim elite, the so-called Bloom Violette project, it went down because of settler opposition. So there's a history. There's also the history, of course, of colonial violence. And French Algeria would not have existed without it. French Algeria was a violent construct. The conquest of Algeria was incredibly brutal. About a third of the population died in the first 30 or 40 years of the colonization process. There were so-called enfumades. These were events where French soldiers would light fires outside of caves where Algerian families had taken refuge, and they would asphyxiate them. And the Algerians, they lost their lands. Their religion was denigrated. It was an incredibly violent process. And as I mentioned, less than 10 years before Fanon arrived in Algeria, there had been a nationalist revolt in eastern Algeria, and it had been crushed with very brutal force. So for Fanon, it's important to remember that violence by the colonized is a counter-violence, and it's a response to a situation where the colonial world, which appears to be, very stable, which appears on the surface to be a peaceful world, is maintained only by violence or by the threat of violence. He does, of course, attribute psychological significance to violence. He believes that violence will awaken the long dormant colonized person from despair, from feelings of passivity and impotence, and provide a kind of, he calls it disintoxication. So the colonized will become aware that they actually can have mastery. They can determine their own fate. Remember, Fanon is a psychiatrist who's very influenced by the writings of Adler. And Adler's main preoccupation was the drive of aggression, which he considered more important than erotic drives. And so Fanon portrays the colonial system as a system in which one group of people, the privileged colonizing group, has the power to express their aggression very freely among themselves, against the colonized, and so on, whereas the colonized are all pent up. And so he writes, for example, that the dreams of the colonized person are dreams of activity. They're dreams of muscular aggression. From 10 to 6 every night, the colonized person dreams of revolt. But otherwise, that aggressive impulse is completely thwarted. So, yes, he argues for violence. However, the nuances are important, and they're often overlooked. For example, Fanon argues that an anti-colonial struggle worthy of the name has to recognize that the camp of the colonizer is not an undifferentiated monolith. There are actually people in that European community who might very well sympathize with the objectives of independence. Fanon knew this because he had been recruited by Europeans like the Dr. Pierre Chollet, who lived his entire life in Algeria, came from a settler family, stayed in Algeria, became an Algerian. I met him in 2002 in Algiers. He had Algerian children, they were European, but they were Algerian, He lived as an Algerian. And so Fanon owed his involvement to the FLN, with the FLN, to the Europeans who had recruited him in Algiers. And so his argument is that the anti-colonial struggle has to sow divisions in the enemy camp. It has to find allies. And it will eventually realize that there are some whites who are blacker than other black people, and that there are some blacks who are whiter than whites. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm not really paraphrasing very liberally here. Fanon writes, moreover, that hatred, revenge, and the legitimate desire for revenge and anti-racist racism, which is a phrase he lifts from Sartre, cannot nourish an anti-colonial struggle. And furthermore, that people don't join an anti-colonial struggle so that hatred can conquer. And there is also that last chapter in The Wretched of the Earth, which I think a lot of people who have a very primitive and crude reading of the first chapter tend to ignore. And that's the chapter on colonial war and mental disorders, where he anatomizes the lacerating and long-lasting effects of violence on the colonized after liberation. And he writes not only of colonial violence, he also writes of anti-colonial violence. There is, for example, the story of an African independence fighter who's undertaken a violent operation during the war. I think he's laid a bomb somewhere. A dozen Europeans were killed. And after the war, he befriends some Europeans who are in his country now, emancipated from colonialism. And every year on the anniversary of his operation, he is afflicted with sweats, violent dreams, feelings of anxiety, and a fear, this dread that he is responsible for the deaths of people who might have been relatives or close friends of the people he killed. So my argument here is not that Fanon is opposed to violence. He's not. But his understanding of violence is much more complicated. And I think often in that chapter, what is taken to be celebration is in fact phenomenological description of what it is like for colonized people to carry out violence against their oppressors. And let's remember, among the most enthusiastic readers of this chapter, this very controversial chapter, was the Holocaust survivor Jean Amery, Hans Meyer, an Austrian fighter in the partisan resistance, who was at Auschwitz or Buchenwald, and who published a very admiring article about Fanon in L'État Moderne in 1969, and said that he could immediately understand Fanon, and that for the persecuted and the oppressed, violence is an affirmation of humanity, and it is different from the violence of the oppressor. So, I mean, I do think these things have to be taken into consideration. I find aspects of Fanon's account of violence to be troubling, and I don't conceal that in the book. I mean, I'm a biographer of Fanon. I am not a Fanonian, but I do think we can learn things from Fanon about the phenomenon of violence, both colonial violence and anti-colonial violence.
And maybe one last question, because we have run out of time, but I wonder, how do you think his legacy is understood differently in France and in the United States, where the concepts of race and the memory of imperialism are quite different?
It's too early for me to judge what the French reception will be, because the book was just published in France on March 21st. But I was in France recently discussing my books with a range of audiences and interviewers, and what I have found so far is that French readers from Algerian, also North African, and West Indian and African backgrounds have been responding very enthusiastically to this book, and seem to feel that its account of Fanon's life and thought really speaks to them, and that's been really gratifying. Now, in France, I did talk about the question of Fanon's thinking and the current war, Israel's war in or on Gaza, but those conversations were less frequent than in the States, where I've had some rather, on the one hand, a very, very positive reception generally, but it's been striking to me that the two currents of criticism that I've received in the States have either been from unconditional defenders of Israel, who have read my book as if it weren't really about Fanon, weren't really about Algeria, but were in fact about Israel-Palestine, and were a kind of, if not a defense of October 7, then some kind of insidious polemic.
They probably didn't read the book.
I wonder. It seems, or they're I'm not sure what you'd call them. Sort of decolonial or radical decolonial, self-styled Fanonians who think that I am sanitizing Fanon and failing to see the ecstatic, liberatory dimensions of violence. I mean, in a sense, it's the same criticism. It really is. The criticism is that I'm trying to add nuance, complexity, and historical context to our understanding of Fanon's work. Now, I'm the last person to deny that there is relevance to Fanon's writing in thinking about Gaza, and I've argued as much in a piece that I published in the London Review of Books a few weeks after the war. And I do think that that Fanon, whatever Fanon would have thought of October 7, I mean, one can only speculate. I don't think that he would have been surprised, because Fanon, I think, understood that extreme forms of violence, of oppression, of dehumanization generate inevitably a counter-violence, and sometimes that counter-violence can be extremely ugly. And I think that Fanon would also not have been surprised by the exhibitionist and spectacular nature of Israel's war against the people of Gaza. I mean, Fanon was someone who wrote of France's war in Algeria and of other colonial wars of repression, that they begin to acquire a kind of genocidal air. So I do think that Fanon would have had much to say, but it's very much my belief that we need to think about Fanon historically, and we need to inject some nuance into our understanding of these writings, and that we're doing a disservice to Fanon, but we're also doing a disservice to ourselves and our own thinking about morally very, very complicated questions with a kind of a flattened and reductive thinking that is the very thing I've tried to get away from. So I make no apology for this. If you find this Fanon to be too complex, too nuanced, this is not the book for you.
All right, Adam Schatz, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to please ask you to consider writing a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.